Yes, good morning, students. We have just listened to a presentation on Hardy and Hardy's tragic vision as expressed in novels like Tess of the D'Urbervilles. We can now take a flight from Hardy's world, from the world of Hardy's tragic vision, to another culture altogether, where fate is not given the kind of importance, or fate or chance is not given the kind of importance that we encounter in Hardy's novelistic world. We move to a system, we move to a culture, we move to a civilization where man, or human beings are considered the masters of their destiny. They have the power to dream and to conquer their dreams, to fulfill their dreams and to conquer their destiny. I'm sure you would have by now got an idea as to what I'm talking about and which paper we are now inching towards. Anyone? Which culture, which civilization, and which paper are we moving towards with this kind of introduction? It is towards the paper on American literature. American culture is, I think, something that can be encapsulated in one phrase that was repeated probably by Obama during his election victory speech. He kept saying, "Yes, we can." And that was a kind of refrain which, the entire crowd started chanting. I think it is something that symbolizes the American vision, the American view of life. It is a civilization that believes that nothing is impossible. If you have the dreams and if you work towards fulfilling your dreams, nothing can prevent you from achieving a golden future. That is what is known as the American dream. And it is towards a discussion of various manifestations of the American dream that we will now move as we take up for study the paper on American literature. And in American literature, the author that I have to discuss with you is somebody who in many ways actually can be considered as a philosopher, a guiding light who led the Americans to believe in themselves and made them convinced about their ability to make it big in life. Who might that be? That is none other than Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the eminent writers, philosophers, and thinkers of America, whose works like Self-Reliance actually define the American vision or the American view of life. I think you don't need a better introduction to either Emerson or to this, this whole paper other than that. Just a second. Yeah, in the previous class, we were actually talking about, is the screen visible to you?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Right. Yeah, so yesterday we were discussing sublimity in literature. Who was the critic who talked or who invited the world's attention to that concept? Sublimity?
Longinus.
Yes, Longinus. Longinus, a Roman critic who lived during the 1st century AD. Yeah, so what is your take-home message from that essay, from the essay that we discussed yesterday? Anyone? You may complete the sentence. A work of art is great, not merely because of dash, 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 but over and above everything because of dash. Please fill in the blanks. A work of art is great, not because of. Can you complete it? Anyone? Amrita?
Not because it's able to instruct and
Right. Continue.
but it is because it's sublime. It takes
Instruct and something else.
delight,
Yeah, delight. Yeah. Not merely because it can instruct and delight, instruct or delight and or instruct and delight, but because of its, right?
sublimity.
Yeah,
Because
and what?
it takes us to a sublime level.
Yeah, its ability to transport you out of yourself. That is what he considers as sublimity. Yeah, just one more question, just to make sure that we are on the same ground. To someone else, let me ask Anjali. Anjali is here. What are the sources of the sublime, Anjali? Not here. Atira? Atulya? Atulya is down after her vaccination yesterday.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
I was in hospital hour.
Pardon?
I just yesterday I was in hospital doing this house vaccination.
So you did not listen to the class,
No, ma'am.
but I have recorded it and uploaded it. If you are not in class, you are expected to
Nondale.
catch up with that. അതിനാണല്ലോ അപ്ലോഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്.
I am very serious. Vaccinated.
ഇന്നലെയാണോ വാക്സിനേഷൻ ചെയ്തത്?
Yes.
ഓക്കെ. നെക്സ്റ്റ് ബിന്ദിയ. Not here. Dhanya.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. പറയൂ, the sources of the
Five
sublime.
sources.
Yeah.
Five sources of
Ah.
sublime. Grandeur of thought, capacity of strong
Capacity
emotions,
for strong emotions. Yeah.
appropriate use of figures,
Mm.
nobility of diction, and final one is dignity of composition.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. So, can anybody tell me one of the figures that he talks about? Appropriate use of figures in the Parno. Can you mention one or two? Anyone? Geetika, Kartika.
Rhetorical.
Rhetoric. Okay. Rhetorical. Yeah. Question. Rhetorical question. Ara parnadada? Who said that?
Shafi.
Ah, Shafi. Good. Okay. One more. Anyone? Sania. Sania has gone. She was here for some time. Anjali. They're not here. I am asking these questions also to make sure how many of you are here in class. Ambili.
Yes, ma'am.
Ah,
I was
sorry.
absent on yesterday.
Absent ആണെങ്കിൽ അതൊരു excuse അല്ല Ambili. You have to catch up because I upload the lesson the very same day. It is for you to catch up with that lesson. Absence is not an excuse.
Sorry, ma'am. I couldn't hear the class.
കേൾക്കണം, ഇതൊക്കെ കേൾക്കണം. ആൻഡ് യു ഹാവ് ടു റീഡ് ദി എസ്സേ ഓൾസോ. ക്ലാസ് എടുത്ത് കഴിഞ്ഞ് എസ്പെഷ്യലി ഓൺലൈൻ ലെസൺ ആവുന്ന സമയത്ത് a great deal of effort is needed from your part also, because this is also distant and remote. So unless you put in some extra effort, none of this will make sense to you. So it's very important when you listen to the class, make sure that you catch up with the text itself the very same day. And if you have missed the class for some reason, you have to listen to the uploaded lecture. Other, it goes without saying. അതിനുവേണ്ടിയാണ് അപ്ലോഡ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. Please do not make us feel that all of these are unwanted exercises. Okay? So a little more responsibility required from your side. Adira? Not here. Okay, Niranjana, you can speak as a leader for the whole class.
Ma'am, actually, I'm not sure about the I just know the 5 sources of the sublime and what
Yeah, fine.
should be
Okay.
avoided. Those which
Yeah,
should be avoided.
what should be avoided? What should be avoided?
Parenthesis, conceit of
Yeah.
turgidity, and one more thing was
Yeah.
there. I'm not able to recall it. Something
Plurality.
like
Plurality.
yeah, plurality. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fine. At least that's good. That's an important point in any case. Yeah, some of the other figures that we discussed yesterday, hyperbaton, periphrasis, and then rhetorical question. Okay, yeah, so please do catch up with the class that was uploaded. Anyway, ഞാനത് കൊണ്ടുവരാൻ also to make sure how you have caught up with the lesson. But more than that, it was to bring back into discussion the word sublimity. We said that it was Longinus who initially talked about that unthought of concept in literary criticism or literary studies. It was not something that had really been discussed much. And he was the one who directed the world's attention to that quality in great works of art. Now, the author that we have got to discuss, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and particularly works like Self-Reliance, have often been considered as the American sublime. It is a sublimity. It is the most pure form. It is the most, what shall you say, the distilled or the essence of American culture. Critics like Harold Bloom, I will share one of the books of Bloom on Emerson with you in the classroom, where he talks about Emerson as the American sublime. Yes, so I'll just make, to get introduced to Emerson and to know more about his position in American literature and to gain an idea of what a work like Self-Reliance means, it is only right that we take a look at a brief look at American literature, the history of American literature. We are familiar with the divisions that historians and critics have made of the periods of English literature, or the history of English literature, the way that it's been divided into ages. We have the Elizabethan age, then we have the Caroline age, we have the neoclassical, the romantic, and then the Victorian, the Edwardian, and so on, the modern and the postmodern, and so on. And we find a lot of references there to the monarchs. Very often it is common to use the names of the monarchs in power to distinguish the various ages of English literature. In American literature, it has, a history not as long as that of English literature or British literature, but one that is considerably long, considerably rich, and one, therefore, that can be studied as a tradition by itself. And when you take up something as a tradition, it is only natural that you tend to look at it as something that evolves over time and concentrate on the different aspects of that evolution, the different stages of evolution. But in American literature, when you try to divide the phases, you cannot come up with the names of monarchs. In the first place, there are no monarchs. And it is not so appropriate to use the names of the presidents, the people in power, to distinguish the different ages. What historians normally do, therefore, is to divide the ages of American literature on the basis of the various wars or revolutions that have changed the course of American history. And one can really find that literature does change, or literary trends do change in keeping with the various wars and revolutions that have happened in the United States of America. So I'll just put up one slide here, which uses the divisions made by one of the critics. But again, unlike English literature, where mostly all the critics would agree with the division of literature into the age of Chaucer, then the Elizabethan age, and so on, right down to the Victorian and then the modern and postmodern ages. Here, different critics have different ways of dividing the history of American literature. This person sees the evolution of American literature over 8 broad periods. It begins, of course, with the late 16th century, 16th to the early 17th century. That is where you have the, the Pilgrim Fathers had not yet landed in America, and you have some oral forms of Native American literature, that various ethnic groups that lived in America, that inhabited America. They probably the Red Indians, then maybe you have a few Inuits and so on, that they had their own oral literary traditions. It is with the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers, the beginning of the 17th century, that you have the arrival of literature, written forms of literature, and the arrival of English as a medium of literary expression in America. And the first phase, therefore, can be, or that early phase can be called the Puritan age. I'll just invite your attention also to the division made by M.H. Abrams in the book A Glossary of Literary Terms. That is another way of looking at American literature. He says that probably the first age of American literature can be called the colonial period. In this division, it is called the Puritan age. Here it is called the colonial period. He dates it from 1607, that is the arrival of the Pilgrim Fathers, to 1775, all the way till the American War of Independence. That can be called the colonial period. That is England with the America with the English Pilgrim Fathers and the English people in positions of power. So at the earliest part of that colonial period is what is known as the Puritan age. The Pilgrim Fathers who came down from England to America brought in a certain kind of Puritanism with them, and that is what prevailed during the first century of literary expressions. You can find the writings of that kind of nature, of a very religious nature, and even the travel writings. Many of them, some of the earliest literary works were the travel writings. When these people came and observed the new landscape, they began writing about those. But even those had a very Puritan kind of spirit. But then with the changing times in England, you find waves of change in America as well. So from 1720 to 1820, you can consider as the age of enlightenment in America. That is when you have the beginning of the spirit of nationalism. So M.H. Abrams would actually call that period, in that age, 1775 to 1865, he would call it the early national period. That is the beginning of that feeling of nationalism and the effort on the part of people and the writers also to assert their American identity, to differentiate themselves from their English ancestors, and feeling very proud and conscious about their Americanness. And this reaches a height during the next phase, 1820 to 1865. That is when you have the period, probably at that time, the richest, the flowering of American literature. It is often called the Romantic Age. It is the period that we have to discuss now when we discuss the work of Emerson, because he's one of the prominent people of the Romantic Age, influenced by the Romantic movement in Europe. not just in England, but also in Germany and other European regions, you have the flowering of a new romantic age in America too. So this is after the the revolution, the major revolution. 1779 is, of course, the American War of Independence. America becomes free of colonial rule. You have the spirit of nationalism emerging, and that reaches a kind of flowering during the period 1820 to 1865 with the Romantic Age. It is also, for obvious reasons, called the American Renaissance. It was a kind of new birth of a typical American literature. You find till then, all the literary works bore the stamp of their English ancestry, the English past. It is only during the early national period that you have differences of opinion. But with the Romantic Age or the age of Renaissance, you have that typical American spirit being expressed in literary works. And you can think of the works of people like not just Emerson, Thoreau. Emerson and Thoreau were close accomplices. And then you have writers like Melville, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. These are the major writers. I'll just invite your attention to a major book written by a critic named F.O. Matheson. That will be in the next slide, which talks about the American Renaissance or the Romantic Age. And then from 1865 till about 1895, you have the age of realism, with people writing about the landscape, probably influenced by the kind of works of Hardy. You can think you can see a kind of similarity there, the age of naturalism prevailing in American literature. You have the works of people like Jack London, Frank Norris, Dreiser, Theodore Dreiser, and so on. They are the representative writers of that age. And then, age of realism, age of naturalism. Then comes the period of modernism. You have the symbolist poets, and you have people like Eliot. Eliot was, of course, an American, and then he moved to England. But the period of modernism, Eliot, Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Hilda Doolittle, Wallace Stevens, they are the major writers of modernism, making it new ways of expression, bold new ways of experimentation, and so on. And then the age of anxiety, parallel to what was happening in Europe, and then the arrival of the postmodern age from the 1960s onwards, and so on. So this is one way of looking at the periods of American literature. You can also read the chapter on period, or the entry on periods of American literature in M.H. Abrams' book to get a better idea. Anyway, our focus, and you will have representative writers in this paper on American literature. You will have representative writers from all these ages, but probably you will not be discussing many of the writers of the Puritan age or the age of Enlightenment. Actually, I think your study of American literature will begin with the real flowering of American literature during the Romantic Age or the age of American Renaissance. It is also, for certain reasons, known as the age of transcendentalism, because this was a period that was powerfully dominated by a group of thinkers and philosophers who were known as the transcendentalists. We will discuss that word and in what way they influenced that age. Anyway, it is during this period that you have the full coming of age of a distinctively American literature, and you have works of great originality and excellence coming up, works which are not mere copies of British or European literature, but which spell out a distinctive American vision, American view, and American way of life. And the best insight that you can get into that age is probably this work of American history, this work dealing with the American Renaissance, age and expression in the age of Emerson and Whitman. That is what F.O. Matheson, he's a major critic, and this book is a very important work of the history of American literature. I've often seen, the net question papers referring to this book. Who wrote it is obviously the most simple question, but who are the authors that this work discusses, and so on. It's a very, very important work of American literature. We have a copy of this in our library. Do take a look at it. And because I think all the authors, the 5 major authors that F.O. Mathieson discusses, will naturally be part of your syllabus. So this 1941 book, it was written much after their time, 1941, but he went back in history and analyzed the importance of these major writers, Emerson and Thoreau, among the essayists and the prose writers, and then among the novelists, Melville, Whitman. Whitman was, of course, the poet. Melville, Herman Melville, the one who wrote Moby Dick, and Houghton, the one who wrote The Scarlet Letter, and Walt Whitman. So Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Whitman, and Houghton. These are the major writers whom he considers as responsible for the American Renaissance. And he calls them, their works as conveying the possibilities of democracy. He presented the American Renaissance text as literature for our democracy and challenged the nation to repossess them. Writing in 1941, he said that we need to bring back the American spirit and bring back into vogue these writers. That is F.O. Mathieson's tribute to these writers. And among these 5 great writers of the American Renaissance, we now have to look at the important role played by Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, who was considered as one of the greatest American essayists, poets, and philosophers. He can easily be considered as the leader of the transcendentalist movement. And if you are to look for one phrase that can encapsulate Emerson, you may call him a champion of individualism. It is in that sense that he becomes, or his works become symptomatic, or let's say his works epitomize the American spirit, the American dream, because the American dream is one that is built on the concept of individualism. You do not have tragic heroes like Tess or Jude whose lives are torn apart by a harsh, inimical kind of fate. Here, whatever the fate, whatever the circumstances, whatever the situation in which you live, if you have the will to go ahead, you can. So that is the American dream as expressed by Ralph Waldo Emerson. So you cannot discuss Waldo, his works, and an essay like Self-Reliance without talking about the movement called Transcendentalism, of which he was really the leader and the mentor. It was, during the 19th century in America, around the region of Connecticut, that is where he lived. You have, groups of writers getting together, and they often met in Emerson's vast estate. He would invite fellow writers, thinkers, and philosophers, and so on, and they would gather very frequently and discuss matters of great philosophical import. And their writings, as conveyed in a journal called The Dial. The Dial was the journal of the Transcendental Club or the Transcendentalists. It was in that it was edited by an important transcendentalist, a lady named Margaret Fuller. And she was one of the chief editors, or she was the editor of The Dial for a very long period of time. And it is in this journal that they wrote some of their original articles. And this was something that had a very powerful effect on America at that point of time. So they were loosely bound together by a kind of belief in an idealistic system of thought that was based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, the innate goodness of humanity, and the supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. In many ways, they were actually influenced by thinkers like Immanuel Kant on the one hand, and the British Romantic writers, especially in the significance that they gave to nature and the importance of insight over reason. What you can grasp through your reason or through your physical perception is nothing compared to what you can grasp through your insight. That inner being is something that they gave a lot of importance to. And it is, in that sense that they were quite mystical in their outlook, very much like the Romantic writers. So they believe that, humankind is capable of far greater things than what the physical circumstances allowed them to enjoy. That is why they are called the transcendentalists. What does that word transcendental mean? Something which goes across, something that goes beyond. You are crossing over to something beyond. Very much like sublimity. Sublimity is also achieving a very high state of experience. It's almost the same kind of thing that the transcendentalists believed the human beings were capable of. And human beings are capable of this because innately we are all very good, we are all essentially united, and there is a great deal that we can gain through this inner eye that nature has blessed us with. And they were greatly influenced by a similar movement in Germany, especially as expressed. They got in touch with the German transcendentalism mainly through the works of Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle. They were quite Platonic in their outlook, and they were also widely read in the scriptures of the Eastern civilizations. So, very scholarly, widely read philosophers who got together and with their very mystical outlook began to write works like Self-Reliance in the case of Emerson. And can you mention the major work of Thoreau? What is the major work of Thoreau? Anyone? Thoreau, somebody who influenced even the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, time and again placed on record his indebtedness to the philosophy of Thoreau. Not just Mahatma Gandhi, but the American civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, all those who fought for the freedom of their fellow beings. They were all mightily influenced by Thoreau. Thoreau was a kind of close friend and maybe a disciple of Emerson. It's the kind of, what shall you say, Socrates or Plato, Aristotle kind of relationship that they had. Thoreau's greatest work is Civil Disobedience. It was what Gandhiji adopted. And the essence of civil disobedience can be found in, not exactly essence, but another major work of Thoreau is Walden. Walden was an experiment that Thoreau conducted by living in a small log cabin in part of Emerson's estate. He built a very small cabin there, a wooden cabin, and he minimized his life. He just reduced his life to the bare essentials. And he wanted to prove to the world that you really do not need wealth or anything else to live. You can live life at a minimal level, at the most simple level, at the most elemental level. And this experiment continued for some 2.5 years. That was when he was actually imprisoned for his act of civil disobedience. He refused to pay the poll tax that was imposed by the American government because he believed that this tax was being used in order to annex more land they would spread their land to Mexico and to other regions and make slavery legalized in all those regions. Thoreau, like Emerson, was dead against that. And Thoreau wanted to protest against that. He took up the method of passive resistance. He knew that as an individual, he could not fight the whole system. But what he could do was passive resistance. And that he did by refusing to pay the poll tax, the election tax. That was his way of protesting against the government, and for which he was arrested. One night he was put in the prison, and that night's experience was what he led to the writing of Civil Disobedience. You know, where he says, I have been chained and I have been put in these big, behind these big walls, but I have never felt freer in my life. There is an interesting anecdote when people like Emerson came that night to meet him in the prison and tried to ensure his release the very next day. Thoreau was asked by Emerson, it is said, what are you doing inside the prison? And Thoreau asked him back, what are you doing outside the prison? You know, a person like you should be protesting against the government and be inside the prison, is what he said. That's an interesting anecdote about the two of them. Anyway, so that is about Thoreau. If Thoreau is prescribed for your study, I'm sure you will talk more about his works like Civil Disobedience and Walden Pond. You know, the log cabin was built on the banks of the Walden Pond, and that is where I know the book Walden is based on that experiment. It gives us an insight into the philosophy of Thoreau, and you can also get a taste of transcendentalism in those pages. So they were always on the lookout for a liberating kind of philosophy. So in a sense, transcendentalism, which is so integral to the emergence of the American independent nation. It was a New England movement. It was in the regions in and around Connecticut, which was a New England state, that it emerged. It was a religious, philosophical, and literary movement that began to express itself in New England around the 1830s and was influential enough for about 2 decades after that. They believed in the importance of a direct relationship with God and nature. They were totally disillusioned by the advances that human beings were making in the field of science and technology and advancing the importance of reason. They believe that, that is something that can have a reductive influence on you. The more you depend on machines, the more you depend on your reason to live life, the greater or the lesser will become the value of life. On the other hand, you should live life at its richest. And that you can do not through the physical or worldly means, not through the path of reason, but through the path of intuition, by having a harmonious relationship with nature and thereby with God. Okay, so it was a kind of American Romanticism, inspired as it was by the European Romantic writers. So it contributed to the founding of a new national culture. As I told you, this was the time that America was emerging after a few decades of colonial rule. The new nation was very much influenced by this transcendental movement. It actually lent the color to that new national culture based on native elements. The transcendentalists advocated a lot of reform in church, state, and society. What was left behind by the English rulers had to be wiped away, and we need a new kind of reform. We need change in religious matters, in matters of politics, in matters of social relations, and so on. And that is where you have the concept of free religion, the abolition movement. It was in many ways something that empowered the removal or the movement towards the abolition of slavery and to the formation of various utopian communities. Walden itself was one such community. So these are just slides that I have put up in order to give you a better insight into transcendentalism. We'll of course be talking about this when we read the essay, Self-Reliance. Yeah, so the spiritual ideals that transcendental philosophers like Thoreau advocated, these ideals transcend the physical world. They are far above the physical world. They believe that you can realize perfection in life, or you can reach God through your intuition and through living in harmony with nature, not through books, not through religion, not through any other rational means. Yeah, so these are the 5 tenets of transcendentalism, the 5 basic principles. Everything is a reflection of God. That is, the unity of all creation was something that they upheld, and which is why they were in many ways responsible for the abolitionists, the movement towards abolition of slavery. And they believed in the innate goodness of people, and they believed in living in close harmony with nature, and they upheld the sanctity of intuition. When you want to live life, live it intuitively. Do not let reason corrupt it too much. Okay? So reason can actually reduce the quality of life. Live life freely at the level of intuition, what your inner being tells you. Don't listen to the head, listen to the heart, is what they would proclaim. So it is in that sense that individuality becomes sacrosanct to them. Individuality and self-reliance are more important than following the majority or the tradition. The majority may prompt you to do something, and your head or your reason will tell you, yeah, that is what I want to do, I should be doing. But your heart might prompt something else. Do not listen to your head or your reason. Do not go or take the road that is taken. Take the road that is not taken. So depend on your individuality and your self-reliance. Another way of looking at it, the 5 eyes of transcendentalism: interconnectivity of man, God, and nature; individualism; intuition; the inherent or innate goodness of everyone; and imagination. You can achieve heights of glory with the power of imagination. So these are the 5 eyes of transcendentalism. I think I will stop there rather than enter the essay. Yeah, so just look at the members of the Transcendental Club, some of the most important members. There you have, of course, Margaret Fuller, who was the editor of The Dial, the chief publication of the Transcendentalists. Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson, Ripley, Longfellow, Hawthorne, they're all at one point or the other members of the Transcendental Club. They would meet together and discuss matters relating to the points that we just discussed. They very often they met in Emerson's estate or in the Boston home of George Ripley, and they brought out the publication called The Dial. Yeah, Emerson was without any doubt the leader of the group. And in the next class, we will discuss self-reliance. Okay? Shall I stop here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.